Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun right when the pandemic came, which shuttered all these independent bookstores and stopped every author's book tour, including mine. And we have somebody special here today, Kitty Zeldis, who has written this amazing book, The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights. I'm going to be talking to her. She's a novelist and nonfiction writer of books for adults and children, including Not Our Kind. Kitty is also a really good friend of mine and has been for years, so I'm really lucky to interview her. I also want to say that nobody knows style and fashion better than Kitty. In fact, she gave me this sweater, this vintage beaded sweater, which I love so much.
Let's see.
Almost as much as Kitty, but not quite. So anyway, let's talk about her book first, and then we're going to talk to her. So The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights is about the lives of three different women in 1924 New York City. Beatriz is trying to establish a dress shop, along with the orphan teen she brought with her from New Orleans. Nearby, a newlywed is longing for a baby and having trouble conceiving. This is truly a novel about the secrets we keep, about mothers and daughters, and about family, both the ones that we make, the ones we choose, and how women really come together to help one another. So Publishers Weekly called this book propulsive. Kirkus, who doesn't always like anything, said it was heartbreaking and intriguing and perfect for historical fiction fans. And Library Journal says that Zeldis has written the type of historical fiction that book groups love. So I want to urge everybody, we at A Mighty Blaze, we love bookshop.org. If you go there, you can buy it from them, or they will tell you where your nearest independent bookstore is. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. And in about 20 minutes or half an hour, we'll get to them. And so welcome to Kitty Zeldis to the Blaze.
Thanks for having me.
We're thrilled to have you. So Kitty, I always want to know what was haunting an author to write their particular book. In other words, the origin story. Mm-hmm. And also, when you tell us this origin story, please don't forget to mention what I thought was extraordinary, which are the Jewish prostitutes in New Orleans in the 20s.
That's the punchline.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, let's round it back.
I will get to how I found that. So yes, this book actually began in New Orleans, where I first went in the late 1980s. I didn't know that I was beginning this book there, that was going to, stay in my consciousness. But I went with my husband, who's a photographer, and we took many road trips together. And he'd been to New Orleans before, and he was very eager that I should like it, and even a little worried that I wouldn't. But I loved it. I don't know how many out there have been, but to me, it's a singular American city with the French influence and the Spanish and the Cajun and the music and streets named Terpsichore and Errato and the streetcar named Desire. I learned the story about that. It was actually Desiree, and they dropped the E in the accent, which was typical. And the Garden District and the French Quarter. So I was all about New Orleans when we left. Like, now is definitely on my radar. So I used to read about it. Whenever I saw something, I was immediately attracted and would pursue it. So that was how I learned that prostitution was legal in New Orleans between 1898 and 1917. And this was not because the city had some progressive Amsterdam-like stance towards prostitution. It was because prostitution was so deeply entrenched, virulent almost, run by such hardened, vicious criminals that there were neighborhoods in New Orleans where if the police were called, they wouldn't go because they were afraid. And the city fathers got together and basically came up with this plan. Alderman Story was the originator of it, that they were going to legalize it within a certain 38-block radius. And that was a way they could get a handle on it. So because his name was Story, it was either called Storyville or the District, and it ran for these blocks. And it encompassed everything from shacks and hovels where you could hire somebody for 10 cents to mansions, row after a row of beautiful, exquisite, oh, by the way, gone now, mansions where there were the most high class of courtesans. And as it happened, this row of the finest brothels in the city was on Basin Street. And Basin Street was right across the street from the train station. So the train would pull in, and there before you would be these incredible building structures, one more magnificent and opulent than the next, with women in the window trying to entice their customers.
Oh my God.
So imagine a guy getting off the train and thinking like, what, where do I go? What do I do? So the city also decided to publish directories, and they were called the Blue Book. And there were small blue books, and they both had ads that the more high-class brothels would pay for, but they listed everybody working in the district by name, ethnicity, and age. And at first these were sold, and very quickly they decided, no, we're not going to sell them, we're just going to give them away at the train station at newsstands. So I saw some of these reproduce, the pages, the ads, and I saw a listing that said white, 21, Jewish. And
wow.
This was the proverbial cattle prod. I thought there were Jewish prostitutes in New Orleans. No one told me that. I need to know about this. But because I am a novelist and not a historian, I was less interested in researching a specific woman who might have had this profile historically, and rather in inventing her. Like, what would make her do that? What would drive her to that? And setting aside the many women and girls we know who are forced into prostitution through no choice of their own.
Right.
But there are those who do choose it. And I guess I was interested in why. What would make her do that? Why would, what in life brought her to that decision? So that is what I tried to do.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, because you wrote a really incredibly moving essay that was in I don't know if it's in the regular book, but it was in the galley, which was amazing, about your grandmother, Tanya Brightman, and how you felt about her when she was alive, which was not very warm feelings. But after she died, you wrote her into the character of Beatrice. I loved reading that, because it felt to me like you were giving her life in your writing. It's almost like writing wrong ways of thinking and understanding people in a different way. So I wanted to know, can you talk more about that process, how you did that and how you felt afterwards?
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. My grandmother was kind of an awful woman, a traumatized woman, I should say. She had really terrible things happen to her, and not a lot of support or understanding about them or how to deal with them. My mother, who's a very forgiving and tolerant soul, would call her alternately Little Hitler or Tiny Tiny. So this is like not my mother. She's generally not judgmental. She's very forgiving.
Wow.
So her mother made her really unhappy. And I saw evidence of this. And there were things my mother has said to me. I will never say what my mother said and did. I will never tell anyone. So, I didn't much like her. I didn't have that much contact with her. She lived in a different city. She was my grandmother, not my mother. So she didn't have so much direct influence in my life. And I basically was annoyed by her and tried to keep my distance. And she'd want to tell me her stories. And I'd be, looking at my watch and tapping my shoe. And I was 45 when she died, which is rather old to have your grandmother still in your life, and totally unprepared for how much grief I felt. I didn't think that I would feel so bad. And with the grief was regret. I found myself thinking about her life and thinking, well, of course she was like that. Look what happened to her, and why weren't you more compassionate? Why weren't you more understanding? And P.S., you weren't a kid. I mean, you were in your 40s during a lot,
right.
30s, old enough to understand how these things might have affected somebody. So I began writing about her, first in short stories and then in this novel. And in my writing, I really wanted to give her the kind of dignity and agency that I wasn't able to give her in life. And I'm not one who believes she's up there in heaven looking down and saying, oh, how nice. I don't believe that. But it definitely quieted something in me that I
love that.
And I have to say, I don't think she ever visited New Orleans. She certainly was never a prostitute or a madam. But the parts about her early life Bee's early life were definitely drawn from her life, because unlike many Russian Jews, certainly my grandfather's family is the more typical one, very poor, literally a dirt floor in the house and one coat that the three siblings took turns wearing. My grandmother's father was a tanner. And tanning was a profession allowed to Jews in Russia because it was so disgusting. Many people did not want to do it. Urine was one of the chief ingredients in tanning the leather. So we can kind of imagine how that would be.
Oh my
like really pretty disgusting, right? And
Yeah.
he was very wealthy for a Jew of that time and place. And my grandmother had described to me a house with parquet floors and velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers, and older sisters that she had a very big family that took ballet lessons and music lessons, and brothers that went to a military academy. Jewish boys in Russia did not go to military academies. They were not admitted. But because of the money in the family, clearly an exception had been made. And this life came to an abrupt and horrible end when her father was murdered. And a story she told me for the first time when I was pregnant with my first child. It was kind of an alarming time to hear a story like that. But I didn't forget it, and I used it in the novel. I don't want to give too much away, but it's that.
Wow.
Definitely drawn from what I remember her telling me.
So I want to talk more about the whole notion of research, because you said you weren't so interested in the details as you were in the story. And I always feel that like that's the key, because you can have 8 million facts and they don't support your story. Right. So when did you know when you were done with your research? And then can you tell us what the research was like?
I don't know that I ever knew that I was done. I kind of research on, I know some people do a lot of research and then set to writing. I was researching on an as need to know basis. And I did put together a tour. I had somebody put together a tour. I went to New Orleans to do research, and I have a friend who went to Tulane, their law school there, and retained, friendships with people she met there. And one of her friends was a retired lawyer who had become a tour guide in New Orleans. So I contacted her and I told her what I was looking to see. And she made a custom tour for me, so
that's great.
Unfortunately, what I really wanted to see were those mansions. They're all gone.
Really?
Nothing exists. I mean, there are pictures of them, but there are no, like on Basin Street, and they even moved the train station. I think when the city ended this legalized period, which was in 1917, and it came about because of the United States entry into the First World War. New Orleans was a port city. So lots of soldiers and sailors filtering through, and it was just too much temptation for them. They got drunk, they disappeared, they got syphilis. So the federal government came along and said, we're shutting this down, and the city pushed back because by this point, we're talking, this had started in 1898, it's now 1917. It had become an important part of the economy, and eventually the federal government did prevail. And so prostitution didn't go away. It just became illegal again. So you could not do it openly. And I think that was a point around then, they decided to tear down those mansions and get rid of any vestiges of it. So people weren't going to go there and say, oh yeah, that used to be like the most notorious brothel in the city, or, like that. They wanted to eliminate those things, eradicate those traces. So it's all gone. But I did get to see the city, and I wanted to see the relationship between where that legalized area was and the rest of the city. How did it relate to the French Quarter? How did it relate to the Garden District? Things like that. So that was useful to just sort of situate it in my head.
Where did your love for history come from? Because if I'm remembering correctly, your first fabulous novel wasn't a historical novel, it was a contemporary one. So what made you decide that you were going to write historical novels?
I kind of bumbled into it, actually. I didn't really, when I write for children, I think all my middle grade novels, all of them take place in the past. I don't know that I guess that's historical fiction too. And that really grew out of my own attraction as a child, not necessarily to historical fiction. I don't remember that term then, but I liked books that had been written in the past. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, A Little Princess, Anne of Green Gables. All these books took place, decades before my life. So when I started writing for children, it felt very natural to me to set stories in these different times. And then somewhere along the way in my writing for adults, I had a novel in which New Hampshire was going to play a major role. And the character in that novel was a writer of historical fiction, as it happened, romances. And I used, there was a particular historical incident in New Hampshire, a woman, very unfortunate woman named Ruth Blay, who was the last woman hanged in the colonies in 1768. And she was accused of murdering her newborn child, not convicted of that, but tried and executed for concealing the birth of an illegitimate child, which was just so shocking to me that that was a capital offense in England, and these colonies were ruled by English governors, and she was put to death in South Cemetery in New Hampshire in December of 1768. So I had sections of that novel that were in the 18th century, and I liked them so much. And I loved writing them. And my agent at the time, she said, I don't think you need all these sections, like just have
no, wrong.
I'm loving it. So I stayed there. And then following that book, I wrote Not Our Kind, which was all set in the 1940s. And I think I found a place that I like. Though I will say, writing a novel set in the 20s versus writing a novel set in the 40s, 20s is much harder. It's just not as visually available. You have to dig.
Right. That's right.
Look at all the films of the 1940s, which we've been watching for years, right?
Right. I watched them when I was a kid.
Right. Exactly. Or photographs. I mean, all that stuff is just sort of more in the culture. The 20s, you have to go looking for it more. And I found it harder, and I will not do it again.
Where did you look for it? Were you going to libraries, or were you finding people who?
One of the things I like to do is I like to look at magazines of the period. Particularly magazines that would have been read by women, because I'm writing about women, and so what's on their minds? What do what do the ads look like? But there aren't that many photographs. The magazines are a little harder to find. All of that. It's just not such an easy visual language to tap into as the 40s or the 50s, say. So I would think twice about doing that again. In fact, as I said, I wouldn't do it.
I always think that historical fiction really says a lot about our lives today, as well as to the time. I mean, I think that's why I love it so much. What do you think The Dressmaker of Prospect Heights says about our world today? It says a lot, I think.
I think some of the issues are really the same. Timeless. I mean, certainly relationships between mothers and daughters, the desire to or not to have a child, and how that impacts you. Having a child that you don't, find yourself pregnant when you don't want to be, unable to get pregnant when you're desperate to be. Those things don't change. And I think that even though there is certainly a greater acceptance of prostitution now, and my daughter informs me that I'm not to say prostitute, I'm to say sex worker. She's very conscious of these things. I personally feel, not from a moral standpoint, I would just put all that aside, but to take this aspect of human experience and communication, sexual intimacy, which has such capacity to give us joy and happiness and satisfaction and fulfillment, and to turn that into a transaction, I think it changes things. I think you are changed inside by doing that. And I said, so that's a very non-judgmental way to describe it, but I do think it makes a big change in the person. And that's true today as it was then.
You gave a wonderful metaphor about how your research was like braiding a challah, making all the strands together, which is wonderful and delicious. So I wanted to know, what kind of writer are you? Do you outline? Do you use Scrivener? Do you use Post-its? Do you plan it out before you start to write it, or does it just sort of spill out?
I am a spill out kind of writer, but this novel had a synopsis because it was bought on, sample chapters, and I had to.
Right.
I don't know about you, Carolyn, but I hate writing a synopsis.
Oh, I can't write synopsis. I always need help doing it. It's a whole different animal.
It's whole, why do you talk about a buzzkill? This is so not a fun thing to do. And
I don't like it either. But you have to have it. You have to have it if you're going to.
I wrote one, and the finished novel had very little to do with that synopsis. My early synopsis, more of the novel took place in New Orleans. They only get to New York at the end, so it's only a couple of chapters in New York. Margaret Sanger was a character. She was brought in at the end. the topic of abortion was front and center, and I kind of left that one behind. I decided there were just like too many things in this novel, and that abortion to me isn't like a kind of sideline. It's like a big thing, and people have strong feelings about it. So if I was gonna have it in there, then I was really going to have to do it justice, and I decided against that. So the synopsis really was not a good indicator of what the finished novel is.
No, it's never the right. Even when I do a synopsis, I rip it up at least 18 times and write a new one, because the book changes,
Right.
But they just want to see the synopsis because they want to know you have a beginning, middle, and an end.
Right.
And they know it's going to change.
If they're going to be handing you money, they want to say, like, all right, show us that you're paying attention here.
Right. So, I was reading all the reviews about your book, and everybody's praising you about your lush descriptions of fashions and customs. And I wanted to talk about your sense of style, because since I've known you, nobody dresses like you do, with such verve and care and attention to like every little detail. And what I love the most is you post on Facebooks these photographs of people that you just saw in the subway with like captions like silver and blue, and somebody's wearing this great shoe that's silver and blue, or checks with stripes, and you have a real eye for this. So what I wanted to know is, were you always interested in fashion? What does fashion mean to your characters? And how much of you is in your character, Beatrice, who owns the dress store?
Well, I have been asked, like, if I, ever studied dressmaking or had any seamstresses in my family, and the answer to all that is no. So my grandmother was good with a needle, but I like to say that if I did that, I would want it to be Martha Stewart, and instead it would be Lucy and Ethel. I mean, I'm just really not skillful, and I would make a mess of it. So I stay away from that. I've always loved clothes. I don't know that I had the language to describe what that meant to me then. I had a beautiful, glamorous mother. She didn't dress in a typical way, but she definitely had a magnificent sense of style. And I could tell you things she wore in 1964, including the accessories. Not just the outfits. And boy, do I wish I had some of these things.
I was going to just ask you if you had them.
No. People didn't keep stuff like that.
No.
Like not, you might keep a wedding dress, but you wouldn't keep just your day-to-day. But I can remember things so vividly, and, being taken to Loman's with her in Brooklyn.
Loman's.
And that dressing room, let me tell you, it's just like a step above the girls' reformatory. I mean, those hard benches. It was really no close. But sitting there wrapped while, she tried things on and touching the dresses and waiting to see what she would look like. And this is something I told to a group recently, but I think it really speaks to what, I think clothes have a lot of power. Mm-hmm. I really do, for women. I think we create ourselves with what we are. This is like how we present ourselves to the world, and we are inventing and reshaping our identities, and that may change in the course of a life, but we're doing this all along. And when I was a small girl, I was bought a little outfit. I was maybe 3 or 4. And it was like a little tennis dress. It was white with a scoop neck and red piping, and a short skirt and pleats, and a little jacket also with the same piping. And Caroline, best of all, an applique of 2 little golden tennis rackets crossed on the top. I couldn't get, like, this was the best thing ever. So I put on this outfit, and then, as it happens, I am taken to the parade grounds with my father and brother to play tennis. They were going to play tennis. When I got there, I was absolutely mystified and disappointed and confused by the fact that I could not play tennis. I mean, no one had ever taught me to play tennis. I never picked up a racket, but I thought that just wearing the clothes
would let you do. That is so amazing.
Would magically confer the power to play tennis. And so during this whole time that they're playing, I'm kind of like wandering around thinking, why can't I do this? I thought I could do this. I thought, like, it was really, yeah.
Do you play tennis now, Kitty?
No, I took lessons one summer.
Okay.
Ethel, I was so bad at it. I like to say I spent my childhood cringing from every ball that came my way, and that didn't change in adulthood. So, the instructor would serve the ball, and I would do that.
That's like me. I'm not a tennis player.
Not my thing. Anyway, I love watching it. I think it's very graceful.
So so when you were researching clothes of the 20s, that must have been amazing. Did you find any of them in the vintage shops? Or I mean, I know
You
20s
don't see
stuff
them
is
in the
hard to
shop so
find.
much because, but it's just that much older and things have deteriorated. That's more like a museum quality, and I did see things in museums, and I certainly looked up famous designers of the period and saw what they were doing. And that was just when, that whole kind of Victorian era is ending and Edwardian, and you're moving into the more modern, Coco Chanel and Paul
Right.
Poiret. And so those things were happening, and changing. And they were very significant. I mean, Chanel in her early days was really kind of a visionary, getting rid of all that complicated underwear that
Right.
women wore that was so constricting and took so much time to put on and take off, and really creating clothes that allowed women to move around more freely and not need other people to dress them and undress them and do what you want. She got a hold of, early on, I read this and I thought this was fascinating, this silk jersey, because I used this in the novel. It was really Chanel. And something had been used for men's underwear.
Oh.
But she used it for women's sportswear. She made sweaters and little sweater sets. So like little shells and cardigans and even skirts. And like, how comfortable was this silk jersey?
Oh,
Right?
silk jersey's gorgeous.
Right?
Gorgeous,
And that's
yeah.
went hand in hand with her whole, like, you start seeing pictures of her in the south of France, and now she's not covering up her face. And this is when tanning becomes popular. Like, women used to shield their skin from the sun, which was actually a good idea. Now we know. But, and you see pictures of her like boating and horseback riding and bicycle riding and leading. And she wore those little
An
French
active life.
sailors, their off uniform, their relaxed uniform, little striped shirts, and those chic. So she was really doing a lot, to sort of reconfigure our eye about how things, and more than just our eye, like really changing how women were going to be in the world. So I think clothes speak to all of that. I don't think of them just as like window dressing, no pun intended. I think they are really important. They're aspirational for us. They're markers of social status. They suggest or don't sexual availability. All kinds of things like that. Like, really...
I definitely think all kinds of fashion, how we appear to others it's of great import. It's like, wasn't it in the 20s when women started finally bobbing their hair?
Mm-hmm. Another thing,
that
like not to have hair that was, like down to your waist.
Yep.
It would have been beautiful, but it's heavy and
heavy and it's hard to style. That story, Bernie Spobs her hair, is Fitzgerald.
Right.
It's like just great story. So let's talk about persecution and intolerance, because that's certainly in this book. And it's also certainly really timely for today. And it seems to be getting worse no matter what we do. So I wanted to know if you could talk about that, and if in writing about it, you saw a solution that we in modern days have not seen.
Solution. That's a hard one.
I know. Well, at least the beginning of a solution. Let's say that.
Well, okay. So I do have thoughts about that. And I think, people have said, like, I write about anti-Semitism, but in my mind, I'm not writing so much about anti-Semitism. It's sort of a byproduct as much as the intersection between Jew and non-Jew.
Mm-hmm.
I think to live as an Orthodox Jew, which I never have, I imagine that there is a sense of safety and comfort, that the community kind of takes you in, and it makes a lot of decisions for you about how you're going to worship and who you're going to marry and how you're going to raise your children and what you're going to eat. All of those things are kind of there as a structure, and you can be brought in and understand your place. But I am a very assimilated Jew. Now, I feel like a Jew all the time, but what does that mean to constantly come up against a wider Gentile world? And Jews are the only people in the West who did not become Christian. I kind of don't get it. Like, it is a source of our singularity, our pride, our, I don't know, nuttiness. Like really, like, why didn't we? I've described this in my mind. It's like we're Bartleby the Scrivener, and like all this great pageantry is happening around Christianity and all this beautiful rituals and churches and celebrations, and we're standing outside and saying, no, thank you, we'd rather not. We're just not going to do that. Like, you can have all that. We're just not going to. And I I am continually interested in that, like coming up against that. And how do we maintain who we are and find a place? And you say, solution. Well, I didn't think of this as a solution, but it just sort of happened de facto. I married a man who wasn't Jewish, and I didn't want him to be Jewish. It was not a value to me. Like, I did not expect him to convert. It never came up. I liked him the way he was, just like he liked me the way I was. And we got a lot of mileage out of that for a lot of years. And so our children, for instance, I mean, I had parents who were quite liberal and would not have thought of them, and progressive, and would not have thought of themselves as bigots. And yet I heard derogatory things about non-Jews that I didn't even realize were derogatory until I was an adult. Like the word shiksa, I thought that I thought that was like the cute blonde your son brought home for Pesach. No.
Oh no, that's a bad thing. Shiksa.
Abomination.
Yeah.
Like, when I learned that, I stopped using the word. Like, I'm not using that word. And I know my husband, he grew up in New England. Like, he heard plenty of things about Jews. Our children never hear any of that. Never heard any of that. There's no us and them. They have parents in each camp. So they have a different understanding of themselves. It's not, it was not polarized for them. So right. I'm all about like that. If there's a solution, I think it's that we need to stop being, all of us, so exclusive, and seeing the ways in which we are alike, which are much more significant and meaningful than the ways that are different.
And also, there's much more pain when you're an outsider. I mean, yes. I think like one benefit of being an outsider is because of that pain, sometimes you have a deeper sense of what's right and wrong than, say, the popular kids who don't need to think about that because they're popular, and their road is just much simpler. Mm-hmm. Did you ever feel that you were an outsider a whole lot, or do you feel that you're an outsider?
Well, not so much in New York, but I grew up in Brooklyn, where I am back again. And certainly there were non-Jews in my neighborhood. They were generally Catholic, either Irish or Italian. Most of those kids went to the parochial school. The Jewish kids went to the public school. There was no particular animosity between us. We might not have hung out together all that much, but we knew, there was no bad feeling either. I'd say this really shifted for me when I went to college. I went to Vassar in the 1970s. I entered in 1974. And although there were Jews, both in the student body and on the faculty, it was like a tsunami of wasps. I'd never met so many of them. And I was fascinated by them, intimidated, envious, painful. They really stirred up a lot in me. And I became aware very quickly that although I loved Vassar and felt very privileged and lucky to have gone there, and it was a wonderful experience intellectually and otherwise, that this was a place based on excluding people like me. Like, Jewish girls were not going to Vassar in the 19th century. They weren't even going for a good portion of the 20th century, except in quoted numbers. And somehow my love for the place had to nevertheless admit that truth, that this was an exclusive place, and part of its exclusivity meant no Jews, or only a very few. Like, that was the deal. That was just the deal. And so, again, it's like, that's what I've been like sort of going over and over again in my mind. It's a subject that continues to interest me. This intersection.
One of the raves for your book mentioned how you created a vibrant portrait of the glee. I love this word, glee, of the glee the three women have when discovering their second acts in life. I love that too, their second acts in life. Can you talk about your own second or third or fourth act? Do you feel like everyone's life should be second acts and third acts?
Well, I guess if you live long enough, you don't want to be the same person, at 60 as you were at 20. I would hope not. I mean, like, being who you were at 20 was good for 20, but hopefully one would have experiences that would, change you and make you see things differently. I see a big divide in my life between children and not before I had them and after I had them. And unlike any number of my friends who always knew they wanted children and, were very eager to find the person with whom they wanted to have them, I didn't want children. I never wanted children. And it was only when I got to be in my mid-30s that I thought, well, I don't know, maybe you want a kid. And I said, if you're going to do it, you should do it now. I was 34. I got pregnant immediately. First time.
Wow.
Oh, I guess we're having a baby. I did. And I described that. And I had a good life before. I am not complaining at all. Lots of very good things in my life. It's like that moment in The Wizard of Oz when it goes from black and white to color. I thought, I mean, I could have missed this. Oh my God.
Right.
That would have been like, I really am glad I didn't miss this. I mean, not that I think that's the only thing in life, but it's a thing. And if you want it, it's a great thing.
That's so funny that you said that, because I also in my 20s, like I don't want to be a mom. Love kids, don't want to be a mom. Same thing in my 30s, started looking around, seeing other people pregnant, started feeling my body. Right. And I loved Jeff, and I kept telling him, well, if you want a kid, maybe we should think about it. And then all of a sudden I wanted one. And once I had one, it was exactly what you said, like everything came out in color. Mm-hmm. It was the most profound experience of my life. And yeah, it's not for everybody. Some women don't want to have kids and they have great, great lives. But right. For me, you shouldn't have it if you don't want to. But for me, like you, it was like Technicolor. It's amazing.
And I now regret, I had a daughter after my son, and when she was born in that hormonally charged whirlwind, I said to my husband, like blubbered, tell me this isn't the last baby. Tell me we can have another baby. He said, we'll have another baby. Let's get you home from the hospital first, okay? Like, can we do that? And I didn't do it. He was on board. I was 39 when she was born, so if I was going to do it, I needed to do it soon. And I didn't. And I know I'm fortunate to have the children I have, but now that they're adults, and I like them so much, I think they're nice people, like I like these two people. They're nice. It would have been nice to have another one. I feel like I had the capacity for that.
Yeah, it's amazing to recognize. It's amazing to recognize that in yourself, the capacity. Mm-hmm. We have an audience question for you.
I see a couple. Advice for new writers?
Yes. What is your advice for new writers?
I have 3 pieces of advice. Okay. I've thought about this a lot. First of all, you rarely get like unbroken expanses of time in which to write. That is not true for most people. So I think it is very useful to give yourself a manageable quota so that you keep writing in your life. For me, that was the first novel that I published. And I had that feeling I wanted to write this novel, and I thought, do I have to wait until they're in college to do this? Like, how am I going to find the time? And I realized those hours between 9 and 3, when they were in school, I committed to producing 2 pages a day. 2 pages a day. Sometimes it could be more if it was going well, but I had to do those 2 pages. And even someone with my limited mathematical skills could see that by the end of the week I'd have 10, and by the end of the month I have 40. And that worked. It kept me in it. Like, it kept me, kind of in the game, like not putting it off to some
right.
So I think that is a really good piece of advice. Piece of advice number 2, do not edit while you are writing. Editing and writing are 2 different skills. They are related. Maybe they have the same foundation, but I think to edit while you write is to inhibit your writing. Just tell yourself, I'll edit it later. Right now I'm going to write it. And then I can go back and edit it. And I am my grandfather used to call me Schnell. That means fast. I do a lot. I write a lot of drafts, and I go through a lot of changes. I have a friend I respect very much. I'll even give her a plug, Patricia Boisman, lovely writer, very graceful, very poised and in command. Her first draft and her last draft are much closer to each other than mine. She works much more slowly. That's her thing. That works. You just have to know your thing. So, but I think the editing and the writing, they're like taps on the faucet, like you got to turn off the editing while you're writing. And then the third thing is find yourself a community of writers. This can be a workshop. It can be a class. I don't know if they're national. Years ago, I taught for the Gotham Writers Workshop. They are great. And they're like a third of the price of everyone else because they're not a matriculated program. Because, showing your work to your boyfriend or your husband or your
it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. For a lot of people, simply having written a novel is an amazing thing. And they're just going to be like in awe because you did it, or a story. You need people who are in the trenches with you, who are trying to figure out the same problems, develop strategies, look at work in this critical way. Like, you need those people. I took many writing workshops. There was one I took in 1984. I forget if it was at the New School or NYU. Anyway, I met somebody in that class, Sally Schloss, plug for her book too. Still my beta reader. Still the first person I show work to when it's finished and ready to show. And I'm the same for her. So, that was a friendship and a writing friendship, a really important friendship forged, in a workshop. So get out there and find your people. People that you can really talk to about this.
I think that's brilliant advice. We have time for one more question. We actually have an audience question. Let's see. Can you talk about what you're working on now?
Only a little bit. It's actually Dressmakers it came slowly and with a lot of revision, and it was a hard one. And after I finished it and turned it in, it was accepted finally. I thought, I'm not going to write another novel anytime soon. Maybe I'm not going to write another novel ever. I can write some children's books for a while. I just need to be done with this for a bit. And then I got an idea, an inspiration, and I was so excited. So I am definitely, immersed in it now. And I have about 8 chapters. I don't want to say too much about it other than it takes place in the 1940s. Back in the 40s again, love that. And it also deals in a different way with this intersection of Jew, non-Jew. That is just a thing that is always going to interest me. My son said to me, Mom, you always want to know who's Jewish. I said, you bet I do. Who knows the world, with the name McDonough. James McDonough, nobody knows he's a Jewish boy unless.
That's right.
Not so for me. So yeah, I'm interested. And I haven't finished being interested. So I'm going to write about it more.
That is wonderful. So I want to remind everybody out there, bookshop.org. You can buy any of Kitty Zeldis' books and or just walk to your favorite indie bookstore and pick it up there. Thank you all so much for being here. This will be on our YouTube.
I could see you. Caroline, can I tell everyone that if they write to me at kittyzeldis@gmail.com,
yes, please do.
I will send a book plate.
That's great.
Nifty little book plates. There's somewhere around here that the publisher gave me, and I will personalize it.
Absolutely. And it's important to have communication between readers and the writers. So absolutely do that. We'll see you all next week. And I want to thank Bo, our magnificent writer and producer. And I also want to thank Kitty, of course, my friend and a brilliant writer and just a work of art herself. Thank you so much, Kitty.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.